The dark night of direction. Why losing your way shows you the way. Have you ever stood at a crossroads in your life and realized that every path forward feels wrong? Not just uncertain, but fundamentally, deeply wrong. As if the compass you've been following your entire life has suddenly started spinning wildly, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once. You look at your career, your relationships, your daily routines, and none of it makes sense anymore. The life you built with such careful intention now feels like a costume that doesn't fit, a script you no longer recognize as your own. This is not depression, though it may wear its mask. This is not laziness, though the world may call it that. This is something far more profound and, paradoxically, far more sacred. This is the moment when the false map burns up in your hands, leaving you standing in the dark with nothing but the terrifying possibility that you've been traveling in the wrong direction all along. What if I told you that this disorientation, this loss of direction that feels like falling apart, is actually the first moment of true orientation you've ever experienced? That the death of your sense of purpose is the birth of something more authentic, that losing your way is the only way to find it. Today, we're exploring the dark night of direction, that excruciating period when life's meaning evaporates and nothing you do feels right anymore. And we're going to discover why this crisis of direction isn't a failure of your life, but the beginning of your real one. It usually begins quietly, a whisper of wrongness you can easily ignore. You're successful, perhaps. You've checked the boxes: education, career, relationships, the right apartment in the right neighborhood. From the outside, your life makes perfect sense, but inside, something has begun to rot. You wake up one morning, and the motivation that used to carry you through your days has simply vanished. The goals that excited you last year now feel hollow, like chasing shadows. You sit at your desk and realize you don't remember why you wanted this job, this life, this version of yourself. The script you've been following, the one that promised fulfillment if you just worked hard enough, achieved enough, became enough, has revealed itself as a fiction. At first, you try to fix it. You read the self-help books, listen to the podcasts, hire the life coach. You make new goals, create vision boards, journal about your dreams. But here's what's maddening: nothing works. Not because you're not trying hard enough, but because the entire framework you're using is the problem. You're trying to find your way using the same map that got you lost. Consider Sarah, a composite of so many stories I've encountered. At 36, she's a senior manager at a prestigious firm. She worked ferociously through her 20s and early 30s, climbing the ladder with determination her colleagues admired. But now, sitting in meetings she once found energizing, she feels like she's watching her life from behind glass. The words coming out of her mouth sound right, but they belong to someone else. She goes through the motions with increasing numbness, and at night, she lies awake with a question that terrifies her. What if I've wasted my life becoming the wrong person? Or think of Marcus, 42, who built his entire identity around being a devoted father and reliable provider. When his children became teenagers and needed him differently, when his wife suggested they'd grown apart, the ground beneath his feet simply disappeared. His sense of purpose was so completely tied to being needed in a specific way that when that role evolved, he discovered he had no idea who he was underneath it. The direction of his life had been determined entirely by others' needs, and now he was standing in a void of his own making. This is the dark night of direction, and it's more common than we admit. It's that period when the life you're living stops making sense, when your ambitions curdle into obligations, when achievement feels empty and rest feels impossible. You look at people around you who seem to have it figured out, and you wonder what's wrong with you. Why can't you just be satisfied? Why can't you just keep going? The conventional wisdom offers its usual platitudes. Find your passion, follow your bliss, just take action. But these answers presuppose that you know what you want, that somewhere inside you is a clear signal waiting to be heard. What they don't address is what happens when the signal itself has become noise, when every option feels equally meaningless, when the very question, "What do I want?" produces only a deafening silence. Here's what makes this crisis so particularly agonizing. You can't think your way out of it. This isn't a problem of insufficient planning or unclear goals. This is a crisis at the level of identity itself. The person you thought you were, the one with clear desires and a coherent sense of direction, has revealed itself as a construction, a role you've been playing, a persona you've been inhabiting, without realizing there was anyone underneath. And so you find yourself in the dark, with no map, no compass, and worst of all, no clear sense of who is actually lost. The you that was supposed to be making decisions, choosing directions, living purposefully, where did that you come from? And if it was always just a construction based on others' expectations, parental scripts, societal pressures, and unconscious imitation, then who are you really? This is the question that the dark night forces upon us, the question we spent our whole lives avoiding through busyness and achievement and the relentless forward motion of goals. And it's a question that cannot be answered the way we answered other questions. It requires something different. It requires us to stop moving entirely. Carl Jung understood something that most modern psychology misses. The loss of direction is not the problem. The false direction was the problem. What we call a crisis is actually the psyche's attempt at a course correction, a compensation for years of moving in a direction determined by everyone but our true self. Jung observed that most people live almost entirely from what he called the persona, the social mask we wear, the adapted self we construct to meet the world's demands. We build this persona carefully throughout childhood and young adulthood. We learn which behaviors get rewarded, which aspects of ourselves are acceptable, which dreams are realistic. Slowly, unconsciously, we shape ourselves into a version of a person who can function in the world, who can get jobs and relationships and social approval. But here's the profound problem: the persona is not you. It's a necessary interface between your inner world and the outer world, but it's not your essence. It's the character you play, not the consciousness playing it. And for many people, the persona becomes so convincing, so thoroughly inhabited, that they forget there was ever anyone else underneath. The dark night of direction is what happens when the persona begins to crack, when the constructed self can no longer contain the unlived life beneath it. Jung called this the individuation process, the psyche's demand that you become who you actually are rather than who you were conditioned to be. And it almost always begins with disorientation, with the collapse of the false certainties that kept you moving in someone else's direction. What Jung recognized is that the psyche has a wisdom the conscious mind does not. Your ego, your thinking, planning, decision-making consciousness, might believe it knows what you want and where you should go, but the deeper psyche, what Jung called the self with a capital S, knows when you've veered too far from your true nature, and it will sabotage your false direction through symptoms that look like failure, but are actually guidance. This is the shadow at work. The shadow contains everything you've repressed to maintain your persona, all the unlived potential, the disowned desires, the aspects of yourself that didn't fit the story you were telling. When you're living a life that requires you to suppress too much of who you are, the shadow grows heavy with unlived energy. Eventually, it erupts into consciousness, not as a dramatic breakdown necessarily, but as a quiet, persistent sense that nothing means what it used to mean. Jung observed this pattern in his own life during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a 6-year period of profound disorientation that began when he was 37. He'd achieved everything his culture defined as success: prestigious position, professional recognition, family, status. And yet he felt increasingly hollow, as if his life belonged to someone else. The direction he'd been moving suddenly revealed itself as empty. He had to descend into the unknown, into the imaginal realm of dreams and visions, to discover what direction actually belonged to him. This descent is what Jung meant by engaging with the unconscious. When you lose your way on the surface, it's because the depths are calling. The psyche is saying, in effect, the path you're on leads nowhere true. It's time to go down instead of forward, in instead of out, into the darkness instead of toward the light you think you should be chasing. Consider what Jung called enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually transforms into its opposite when taken to an extreme. You pursue success relentlessly, and it becomes a prison. You dedicate yourself to being needed, and it becomes exhausting emptiness. You build your entire identity around one direction, and that direction becomes the very thing that alienates you from yourself. The psyche, in its wisdom, brings you to the opposite to restore balance, to force integration of what you've been excluding. The dark night of direction is the psyche saying, you cannot go further on this path, not because you've failed, but because you've succeeded at the wrong thing. You've become very good at being someone you're not. You've moved very far in a direction determined by the collective, by your parents' unlived dreams, by cultural scripts about success and worth. And now the unconscious is withdrawing its energy from that false direction, leaving you stranded in the dark so you can finally ask the question you've been avoiding. What direction actually belongs to me? Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he understood that becoming who you truly are requires first the death of who you falsely thought you were. The persona must crack. The false map must burn. The constructed direction must be revealed as insufficient. Only then, in the directionlessness, in the not knowing, in the dark night itself, can the true self begin to emerge. This is why Jung insisted that the goal is not to eliminate the crisis, but to enter it fully, to allow the disintegration it brings. The dark night of direction is not a problem to be solved, but a threshold to be crossed, a necessary dying that precedes a more authentic rebirth. You cannot find your true direction while still clinging to the false one. The psyche knows this, even when your ego desperately wants to skip the dark night and get back to feeling certain about where you're going. What we call losing your way is more accurately described as the false way losing its hold on you. And in the space that opens, that terrifying, disorienting space of not knowing, the psyche finally has room to reveal what was always there beneath the persona, beneath the scripts, beneath inherited directions you've been following without question. Jung understood that the treasure is in the cave you're afraid to enter. The direction you need is hidden in the directionlessness you're desperately trying to escape. The way forward requires first going down, going in, going through the darkness instead of around it. The existential philosophers understood what Jung intuited psychologically, that we spend most of our lives fleeing from freedom into predetermined paths, and that genuine existence requires confronting the terror of having no given direction. Kierkegaard called this the sickness unto death, a despair that comes not from external circumstances, but from the failure to become oneself. He distinguished between two forms of despair: despair at not willing to be oneself, and despair at willing to be something other than oneself. Both forms, he argued, are ultimately a refusal of the authentic self in favor of a more comfortable, socially validated persona. The dark night of direction is what happens when this refusal can no longer be sustained, when the constructed self begins to collapse under the weight of its own inauthenticity. What Kierkegaard recognized is that most people never truly choose themselves. They adopt ready-made identities, follow prescribed paths, live according to scripts written by family, culture, and the they. Heidegger would later describe the anonymous collective voice that determines what one does. To truly exist, Kierkegaard argued, one must make the leap into authentic selfhood, which requires passing through anxiety, despair, and the terrible freedom of having no map. Nietzsche took this further with his concept of the Übermensch, not a superhuman in the literal sense, but a person who has overcome the need for external direction, who has destroyed the old tablet of value and created their own. Nietzsche understood that we must become who we are, but that this requires first destroying who we've been told to be. You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. He wrote, "How could you rise anew if you have not first become ashes?" The dark night of direction is this burning. It's the moment when the old values no longer compel you, when the directions that once seemed absolute reveal themselves as arbitrary constructions. Nietzsche called this the moment of nihilism, the recognition that there is no inherent meaning, no given purpose, no cosmic direction we're supposed to follow. This recognition is terrifying, but Nietzsche saw it as necessary. Only after passing through nihilism, only after sitting with the possibility that nothing means anything, can we begin to create meaning authentically rather than inheriting it unconsciously. The Eastern philosophical traditions approach this from a different angle, but arrive at a similar truth. Buddhism speaks of anatta, the no-self, the recognition that what we call I is a construction, a pattern of habits and identifications with no solid core. When you lose your sense of direction, what you're really losing is the illusion that there was ever a solid self with a predetermined path. You're confronting the groundlessness that was always there beneath your certainties. The Tao Te Ching teaches that the way that can be named is not the eternal way, that true direction comes not from striving, but from aligning with the natural flow of things. When I let go of what I am, Lao Tzu wrote, I become what I might be. The dark night of direction is this letting go, this release of the constructed identity that blocks access to a more spontaneous, authentic movement through life. Heidegger's philosophy circles around this same truth from yet another angle. He argued that we exist primarily in a state of fallenness, absorbed in the everyday world, distracted by its demands, living according to its predetermined possibilities. We are thrown into a world not of our choosing, and we typically respond by adopting ready-made ways of being, becoming what they say we should become. Authentic existence, Heidegger insisted, requires confronting our being towards death, recognizing our finitude, our groundlessness, the fact that no external authority can tell us how to be. The dark night of direction is this confrontation. It's the moment when being towards death breaks through the comfortable illusions of the everyday. You realize that you will die, that time is limited, that the direction you've been following leads to a death that feels like a waste because it's not your death. It's the death of the persona, death of the false self, the end of a life unlived. Sartre added to this that we are condemned to be free, that the burden of human existence is that we must choose, that there is no essence determining who we should become. This freedom is agonizing because it removes all excuses, all refuges in predetermined meanings. The dark night of direction is the collapse of bad faith, the dissolution of the stories we tell ourselves about who we had to be, what we had to do, which paths we had to follow. What emerges from all these philosophical perspectives is a recognition that the loss of direction is actually a confrontation with reality. The reality that we are fundamentally free, fundamentally groundless, that there is no cosmic script we're supposed to follow. The direction we thought we had was always a construction, a story we told ourselves to manage the anxiety of freedom. But here's where it gets interesting, where the philosophical meets the psychological. This freedom is not the simple, exhilarating freedom of possibility the motivational speakers talk about. It's the terrifying freedom of having to create yourself from nothing, of having to choose when there are no given reasons for choosing, of having to find meaning in a universe that offers none. This is why most people flee from it. This is why we build personas, adopt ready-made directions, follow inherited scripts. The alternative seems unbearable. Yet the mystics and depth psychologists both understood something the existentialists sometimes missed. There is something beneath or beyond the constructed self. Jung's self, the Buddha's true nature, the Tao, Heidegger's authentic being. Different languages for the recognition that when you let go of the false direction, when you sit with the groundlessness, when you stop trying to construct yourself according to external demands, something else emerges, not a new construction, but a discovery, not a path you create through willpower, but a path that reveals itself when you stop forcing. This is the paradox at the heart of the dark night of direction. You have to lose your way completely to find the way that was always there, beneath your efforts to have a way. You have to sit with meaninglessness long enough to discover a meaning that doesn't need to be constructed. You have to die to the false self thoroughly enough that the true self has space to breathe. So what does this actually look like in the midst of your life falling apart? How do you navigate the dark night of direction when you still have bills to pay, relationships to maintain, a world that demands you appear to have it together? First, you have to recognize what's actually happening. The dark night of direction announces itself through specific symptoms. You might notice that activities that used to energize you now drain you. Goals that once excited you produce only numbness. You go through the motions with increasing effort and decreasing satisfaction. You feel like you're living your life on autopilot, watching yourself from a distance. There's a persistent sense of wrongness you can't quite articulate, a feeling that you're in the wrong place living the wrong life, even though nothing about your circumstances has objectively changed. When these symptoms appear, the instinct is to fix them quickly. But here's what's crucial. The dark night requires you to resist the impulse toward immediate solutions. This is not a problem to be solved, but a process to be undergone. The first and most important practice is to stop trying to get back to certainty, to stop forcing yourself to know what you want, to stop making decisions from the place of the old persona. This means entering what Keats called negative capability, the capacity to remain in mysteries and doubts without irritably reaching after fact and reason. It means learning to sit with not knowing, to tolerate the anxiety of directionlessness, to resist the pressure from yourself and others to have it figured out. In practical terms, this might mean telling people "I don't know" when they ask about your plans, your goals, your 5-year vision. It might mean taking a break from self-improvement projects and goal-setting exercises. It might mean allowing yourself to feel lost without immediately trying to get lost. This is harder than it sounds because our entire culture is built around having direction, knowing what you want, moving toward goals. The second practice is to pay attention to what naturally withdraws and what naturally emerges. The dark night has a wisdom to it. The psyche withdraws energy from what doesn't belong to you and makes available energy for what does. But you have to listen. What activities feel genuinely enlivening versus what you think should enliven you? What draws your attention without you forcing it? What are you curious about that has nothing to do with career advancement or social validation? This is where Jung's practice of active imagination becomes invaluable. Instead of trying to think your way to a new direction, you allow the psyche to speak through images, dreams, creative expression. You might journal not about goals, but about what appears in your inner world. You might paint, make music, move your body in ways that bypass the rational mind. You're listening for something deeper than preferences, something more fundamental than the ego's desires. Third, you have to be willing to disappoint people. The dark night of direction almost always involves pulling back from commitments made by the false self. This doesn't mean burning your life down, though sometimes it does. But it means being honest about what you can no longer authentically show up for. This is agonizing because the persona was built precisely to meet others' expectations, to be reliable in the ways they need you to be. But continuing to live from the persona will only extend the dark night, turning it from a productive crisis into a chronic malaise. You might notice that relationships begin to shift during this period. Some people in your life will be threatened by your uncertainty, your pulling back, your refusal to continue performing your old role. This is information. These are relationships that were based on your persona rather than your authentic self. Other people, fewer, perhaps, but more genuine, and will give you space, will meet you in the uncertainty, will love you even as you admit you don't know who you are or what you want. The fourth practice is to notice what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to arise just when you need them. In the dark night, when your conscious will has failed, when you've stopped forcing a direction, the unconscious often provides guidance through the external world. A book falls into your lap. A conversation opens a doorway you didn't know existed. An opportunity appears that wasn't on your radar. These aren't magical occurrences, but the natural result of the psyche aligning inner and outer when you stop imposing your will on both. Fifth, and perhaps most challenging, you have to grieve. The dark night of direction is a death, the death of who you thought you were, the death of the life you thought you were building, the death of the future you had planned. This death needs to be mourned. You need to feel the sadness of the years spent moving in someone else's direction. You need to acknowledge the loss of certainty, the loss of the comfortable persona, the loss of the identity that brought you social validation, even if it brought you no genuine satisfaction. This grieving isn't self-pity. It's honoring what was, acknowledging the cost of transformation, allowing yourself to feel the full weight of letting go. Without this grief, you'll either cling to the old direction or rush into a new direction that's just another version of the persona. What you're looking for in this process is not a new goal or a new plan, but a different quality of being. You're learning to distinguish between movement driven by anxiety, obligation, and external validation versus movement that arises from something deeper, something more essential. This is subtle. It requires you to get very quiet, very still, very honest about what's actually yours versus what you inherited, absorbed, adopted without consciousness. The integration that's possible on the other side of the dark night is a life lived from the inside out rather than the outside in. Decisions made not because they're what you should do, but because they resonate with something fundamental in you. A direction that feels less like following a map and more like water finding its level, like a plant growing toward light. Natural, unforced, authentic. But you cannot rush to this integration. The dark night has its own timing. You cannot skip the disorientation, the not knowing, the sitting in darkness. These are not obstacles to finding your way. They are the way itself. Something shifts, finally, though you can't always pinpoint when or how. You wake up one morning, and the oppressive quality of the uncertainty has lifted slightly. Not because you've found answers you haven't, not in the way you expected, but because you've become more spacious with the questions. The anxiety of not knowing transforms into something closer to curiosity, or perhaps acceptance, or perhaps a kind of faith you didn't know you had access to. You notice that you're making decisions differently, not through elaborate pros and cons lists or by consulting external authorities, but through a kind of inner resonance. Something feels right not because it makes logical sense or because others approve, but because it aligns with something you're beginning to recognize as you. Not the you of the persona, but something quieter, deeper, more fundamental. The transformation that emerges from the dark night of direction is not a return to certainty. You don't suddenly know your life purpose, don't suddenly have a clear 10-year plan, don't suddenly feel like you've got it all figured out. Instead, you develop a different relationship with not knowing. You become comfortable navigating by feel rather than by map, by listening rather than by planning, by following what Jung called the transcendent function the psyche is natural movement toward wholeness. What changes most profoundly is your relationship with yourself. The person you see in the mirror is no longer a stranger or a disappointment. There's a growing sense of recognition, of coming home to yourself. The gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be begins to close. You find yourself saying things you actually mean, making choices that actually reflect your values, showing up in ways that feel authentic rather than performed. This doesn't mean you've become perfect or enlightened or fully individuated. Jung himself said that individuation is a lifelong process, never complete. But you've crossed a threshold. You've survived the death of the false self and discovered that there's something real underneath. You've sat with the groundlessness long enough to find your own ground. Paradoxically, as you stop trying to force a direction emerges. Not a rigid path you must follow, but a kind of magnetic pull toward what's alive in you, what wants to be expressed through you, what Jung would call your vocation in the deepest sense, not your job necessarily, but your calling, the unique way you're meant to participate in the world. You might notice that you're less interested in proving yourself, less concerned with external validation, less caught in comparison and competition. Not because you've transcended your ego, you haven't, but because you've found something more interesting than the persona's achievements. You're interested in depth now, in authenticity, in the quality of your presence more than the accumulation of accomplishments. The relationships in your life have likely shifted. Some have fallen away naturally as you stopped performing the old role. Others have deepened as you've become more genuine. You attract different people now, people who meet you in depth rather than surface, people who are also on the journey of becoming rather than the performance of having arrived. There's a quality of aliveness that returns, not the manic energy of striving, but something more sustainable, more grounded. Activities that had become dead obligations might fall away entirely or might be re-engaged from a different place, not from duty or external pressure, but from genuine desire or consciously chosen commitment. This transformation is subtle, gradual, easy to miss if you're looking for dramatic change. But people who have known you might notice something different in your eyes, in your presence, in the way you inhabit your own life. There's less performance, less anxiety, less of the exhausting effort to be someone you're not. There's more ease, more authenticity, more of whatever that quality is that draws people toward genuinely individuated people. Not because they're perfect, but because they're real. And yet, and this is crucial, the journey isn't over. You haven't arrived at some final destination. The dark night of direction may return in different forms as new personas develop, as new false certainties calcify, as life continues to demand that you grow beyond who you currently are. But you've learned something fundamental, that losing your way is not catastrophe but invitation, that disorientation is not failure but transformation, that the dark night is not something to escape but something to enter. You've learned to trust the process, to trust the psyche as wisdom, to trust that when everything falls apart, when direction dissolves, when you find yourself lost in the dark, something essential is trying to find you. So I return to the question we began with. Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life? Like the person you see in the mirror is a stranger wearing your face. Now, perhaps you can see that feeling differently, not as a problem to be fixed, but as a message from the depths. Your psyche trying to tell you that the person you've been trying to be isn't who you are. That the direction you've been following with such determination leads away from, not toward, yourself. The dark night of direction is not a punishment for having failed. It's a mercy, actually. The psyche's refusal to let you waste your entire life traveling in someone else's direction. It's the unconscious saying, stop, turn around, go down, go in. The way you've been going leads nowhere true. And yes, it's terrifying. Yes, it feels like falling apart. Yes, the uncertainty is agonizing, and there are no guarantees. And you can't know ahead of time who you'll be on the other side of this darkness. But consider the alternative, continuing to move with false certainty toward a destination that will feel empty when you arrive because it was never yours to begin with. Spending your one precious life becoming excellent at being someone you're not. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But perhaps what's even more terrifying is to not accept oneself, to spend your whole life rejecting your authentic nature in favor of a more acceptable persona, to die having never lived as yourself. The dark night of direction offers you something rare and precious, the chance to lose your way so completely that you have to find a new way, a truer way, a way that actually belongs to you. Not the way that's been prescribed, inherited, or adopted unconsciously, but the way that emerges when you stop running from the darkness and start listening to what it has to teach you. So if you find yourself lost right now, if the path ahead has vanished and nothing makes sense anymore, if you're standing in the dark with no compass and no map, know that you're not broken, you're not behind, you haven't failed. You're right where you need to be. You're in the place where real direction becomes possible, where the false self finally gets out of the way, where the life you were always meant to live can finally begin to find you. The dark night of direction is asking you one question, and it's the only question that matters. Will you have the courage to lose your way long enough to find it? The journey continues always, but now, perhaps, it's finally yours.